Hi, I'm Sonya White Jaguar. Welcome to White Jaguar Weekend Read, my weekly audiobook series. Today, I'm reading the conclusion of my free book, Writing Alan Rickman's Autobiography of Fan Fiction Romance. Chapter 16, The Eternal Garden. To my horror, Alan explained that he'd recently been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, one of the deadliest forms of cancer. The disease exhibits no symptoms early on, so it's most often discovered in late stages when it's more difficult to treat. As a result, the prognosis is rarely good. Listening to him was like watching a man drown in an undertow. You're holding onto a tree branch for dear life, wishing you could reach down and pull him out. But you know that if you try to save him, you'll drown too. So you helplessly cling to the tree and watch him go. The guilt is indescribable. I yearned to rip the tumor from Alan's body. If I could have waved the Snape wand he'd bought for me at Universal Studios and magically removed the cancer from him, I would have. I wished I could have traded places with him and died for him so he could live on. His life felt more precious than mine. I wanted him to continue working and traveling, delighting audiences, and enjoying the company of his friends. I wanted to tell him not to leave me. Totally overwhelmed, I was unable to find words to express the emotions swirling around inside me. Desperate to stop the invisible stabs penetrating my heart, I could think of only one thing to do. Tightening my grip around Alan's shoulders, I made love to him passionately. Our gentle rocking caused water to splash over the top of the hot tub and puddle on the otherwise immaculate terrace floor. Neither of us cared. For that brief time, we could pretend nothing was wrong. Later, while we ate a solemn dinner in the kitchen, Alan told me it was unlikely I'd see him again. "I'll be selling the apartment, so I want to give you some of my things. Things I think you'll appreciate that won't mean as much to anyone else." We got up from the table and he told me to wait there. I watched as he darted around the apartment. First, he padded over to the fireplace, where he carefully took down the Pisces watercolor of the two fish swimming in opposite directions. After laying it on the kitchen island, he then went to the bedroom. A minute later, he returned with his acrylic painting of the two lovers. After resting it on top of the fish painting, he added the garden sketch he'd worked on sometimes while we were discussing his book. Lastly, he placed on top of the pile the portrait he'd made of me, along with the red scarf I'd worn for him that night. "They're yours," he said. "When I first invited you here, I thought I wanted to write my autobiography. But I just couldn't do it. It's too complicated." He shrugged. "I'm too complicated. You became far more important to me than the book. What I really needed was someone to talk to." He surprised me by saying he'd pay me in full, even though his book would remain uncompleted. "It's the least I can do for you. I know that my money and artwork can't take my place, but it's all I have to give." Then he wrapped his arms around me and held me close to him. Softly, he whispered in my ear, "Tell me you'll be all right without me." All I remember after that was a stream of tears and sobs, and they weren't coming from Alan. Months later, I had a vivid dream after falling asleep on the living room couch in my apartment. Alan and I were making love on the floor in his bedroom. The room had been stripped of all furniture, and the walls were bare. Then the scene changed. I was standing beside Alan in his living room. All of his paintings and other personal effects were stacked up in the middle of the room. Without a word, he lit a match and threw it onto the pile. We stared at each other blankly as everything went up in flames. I awoke right after the dream. When I sat up, my eyes fixed on Alan's artwork, which was leaning against the wall across from the couch. Slowly, I stood and crossed the room to look at the pictures. I hadn't found the strength to do anything with them since I'd brought them home the last day I saw Alan. The first piece was the watercolor of the two fish. When I'd first visited his apartment, he told me a friend had made that painting for him as a birthday present. What I'd seen in the image at the time was the Ouroboros, the ancient symbol of a snake eating its tail, which represents the never-ending cycle of life and death. That made me shiver now. I set the fish painting aside and gazed at the next piece, Alan's old painting of two lovers in ecstasy. Although I didn't like the painting at first, I would treasure it now as a symbol of our relationship. I fought back tears, knowing I'd never be able to embrace him like that again. Then I went to my utility closet to find a hammer and nails. Afterward, I took the two paintings to my bedroom and hung them side by side above the bed. When I returned to the living room, I looked at the remaining artwork Alan had given me, his two drawings. First, I picked up his garden sketch. He'd said it was merely a doodle to help him whenever he had a lot on his mind. However, the image didn't feel like that to me. The open blossoms were colorful and jubilant, and just as sexy as the two lovers in his painting. In fact, the drawing reminded me of the work George O'Keeffe is known for. George O'Keeffe is a controversial 20th century artist who denied that her famous depictions of oversized flowers were metaphors for the woman's womb. Since Alan had been a supporter of women and encouraged me to step out and express my truth as a woman, I wondered if he'd been a fan of O'Keeffe's work. I wished I'd had the chance to ask him. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I glimpsed a butterfly above the blossoms in the middle of the sketch. I looked at the drawing more closely, but there was no butterfly. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, but I like to think it was Alan flying around the garden, finally finding his place in eternity after struggling to find peace here. When I picked up the sketch Alan had made of me, I felt his love wash over me. I was overcome by the feeling he'd want me to move on with my life. He'd want me to live my life to the fullest and find happiness in new experiences. I could almost hear him say, "Dance, allow yourself to feel sexy, be a powerful woman." As I set the two sketches on the coffee table, I spotted Alan's red scarf on the floor. It had apparently fallen behind the artwork when I'd set the pieces against the wall. I forgot that Alan had given the scarf to me. I picked it up and draped it loosely around my neck. The day I'd met Alan at the party celebrating a little chaos, he'd come up behind me and danced me around the room. Now, while I gazed at his sketches, I held the two ends of the scarf out in front of me and swayed and shimmied as if I were dancing with an invisible partner. No one else loved me the way Alan did. As a busy man who was always on the go, he carved out time for me in a way I wouldn't have expected from someone in his position. He admired my writing and even called me an artist. Nobody had ever called me that before. He helped me be more comfortable in my body and own my sexuality as a woman. He taught me how to fly and see from a higher perspective. It was a cruel twist of fate that cancer took him before we could build a life together. Everything had happened so fast, I wasn't certain if any of it was real or if it had been a dream. All I know is that the grief sat heavily on my chest for a long time. That was real for sure. To comfort myself, I read the notes I'd made for Alan's autobiography when we were working together. To my amazement, his presence felt strong in the scribbled words. As I kept turning pages, I remembered how sometimes he was so warm and open with me. Other times he was elusive and moody. He'd be hilarious one moment and say something serious and profound the next. He could be charming and difficult at the same time. Who he was in his various contradictions shone through my writings. If Alan were here, he'd say that he was nobody special, that his life was no more important or interesting than anyone else's. As an actor working in the storytelling business, he wanted to tell other people's stories, not his own. I learned from him that the fantasy world of the theater and films has one main goal: to hold up a mirror to us so we can see our own messy emotions, contradictions, lessons learned, and everything in between. Stories, like life itself, aren't necessarily going to provide answers to our questions. We must accept the mystery of who and what we are. Alan had told me he was attracted to scripts that explored real emotions. As a sensitive man, he liked fearless writing. He wanted people to say what they had to say without holding anything back. He wanted to see the truth expressed, on the page and on the stage. That's what he was teaching me to do. Through our emotional connection, he showed me that the most memorable writing is about emotional connections. Now I understood how to develop a new career as an author of women's literature. Women almost universally are seeking an emotional connection. That would become my new focus as a writer. Additionally, that became the focus of the memoir you're now reading. Although Alan and I had failed to write anything substantive together, my notes told a story. That story didn't paint a clear picture of Alan's life, but it showed an emotional connection. That was enough. Writing this memoir was the last thing I could do to honor him, show what was in his heart, and celebrate a life that had ended too soon. Alan died 2 months after he told me he had cancer. That's when I discovered I was pregnant. Alan had a new life, and so did I. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, join me for the following video where I share a special inside look at the making of writing Alan Rickman's autobiography.